Today's episode is proudly sponsored by the Rising Tide Mastermind. When was the last time you read a book and you actually applied it to your day-to-day? Well, that's one of the things that we do within the Rising Tide Mastermind. No, it is not a book club, but we do use books to enhance our core knowledge on how we approach our day-to-day lives, how we approach the goals that we have in business. And then we read those books and we figure out how we help each other with the techniques that we learn within that book to help the day-to-day. We get above the day-to-day so we can affect the day-to-day. If this is something that sounds interesting to you, I would love it if you went to scalinguph2o.com/mastermind to find out more and to see if this group is right for you. Welcome to the Scaling Up H2O Podcast, the podcast where we scale up on our knowledge so we don't scale up our systems. I'm your host, Trace Blackmore, and Nation, we made it to June 2023. Seems like just yesterday we were talking about welcoming in 2023. And now we're halfway through it. And I don't know, each and every year it seems to go by quicker and quicker. And if that's not a lesson to take advantage of each and every day and make sure that everything that you do has purpose, everything that you're doing is growing you to become a better you, and above all else, making sure that you are helping somebody else become better too. Now, maybe that is training them to become a better industrial water treater, or maybe that is just being kind in your words. And think about that. That's all it takes is for us to be kind in our words, and that changes everybody else's day. And I'm sure if you think about that happening to you and how somebody's kind words impacted you, imagine if you could get that each and every day. Well, unfortunately, we can't control getting that, but we can most certainly control giving that. So it's my challenge to you that you are using kind words in each and every interaction that you have. I promise it will create a ripple effect that will help not only us, but everybody we interact with. Nation, what are some things that we can celebrate in June? So I looked at the calendar, and I know we are in 90 plus countries around the globe. Well, I'm looking at my United States calendar. So for everybody in the Scaling Up Nation that is outside of the United States, you can play along with some of the things that we are doing here in June. So on June 5th, it is World Environment Day, and this is a day meant to increase our awareness around environmental issues across the globe, and how can we be a part of that change? Well, Nation, that's got water written all over it. So I urge you to see what you can do on June 5th to help some of the environmental issues that we have around our industry. On June 14th, the United States celebrates Flag Day. So be sure to raise your flag. And you can learn about the flag code. We're actually going to put the U.S. flag code on our website. So if you ever wondered what the proper way is to display your flag, wonder no more. We're going to have all of that for you so you can fly your flag properly. Next, June 18th, which of course is Father's Day. And Nation, I am so excited for this one because it is my first Father's Day ever. One of the items that I got to celebrate this year is we adopted our son. So June 18th is my first Father's Day, and I cannot wait. On June 19th, we call this Juneteenth, And this was to celebrate on 1865, Union General Gordon Granger read the Emancipation Proclamation aloud in Galveston, Texas. And this effectively liberated all of the slaves within the United States. And this was a huge turn point because at this point in 1865, the Union was not able to do that. So if you wanted some more information around Juneteenth, that is the official day that it started. And of course, just recently, it became a holiday that we celebrate each and every year here in the United States. June 21st is summer solstice. And this is the start of summer in the Northern Hemisphere. And it's also the day with the most hours of daylight. So enjoy it. You're going to get the most daylight of the entire year that day. Make sure you're taking advantage of June 21st. Also, June 24th, that is Midsummer Day, and this is the midpoint of growing season. This is halfway between the planting and the harvesting season. So many cultures celebrate June 23rd as Midsummer's Eve, of course, making June 24th Midsummer's Day. Nation, did you know about all those holidays? Maybe you added some on your calendar, and it's my hope you're just celebrating each and every day on your own. But now you've got some extra reasons to celebrate. Now, here are some events you may want to celebrate by putting on your calendar. The American Waterworks Association is having their ACE 23 conference June 11th through 14th in Toronto, Canada. This is where the water treatment community comes together to learn, connect, and inspire to solve global water challenges. The AWRA, which stands for the American Water Resource Association, Summer Conference is taking place June 17th through 19th in Denver, Colorado. This is where stakeholders across multiple disciplines come together to design, integrate, and implement programs necessary to better connect land and water planning and policy. We'll have information about this on our show notes page so you can learn more. And then finally, the WEFTech conference, which is taking place in Chicago, is your place to learn, experience, touch, feel all of the latest, greatest equipment and technologies in the water industry, build new relationships, and figure out how you can serve your customers better. This will be September 30th through October 4th. To find out more, go to our events page where we will have all of this and more for you to browse right at your fingertips. Nation, I do want to urge you to use our webpage, which is scalinguph2o.com. We pack a lot of information within these podcasts, and I know that this podcast format is so beneficial to our industry because we spend so much time driving to and from our accounts. Well, when we're driving, we can't take notes, but don't worry about that. Just get in the habit that after you listen to an episode, you go to scalinguph2o.com and we will have everything about that show, everything about the events that we mention for you to, at your pleasure, your leisure, your safety, go through and make sure that you are getting all the information that you need from this podcast. Nation, you know I'm always urging you to go to the events that we talk about here on the podcast. Well, one of the organizations that we really try to promote because it's been so good to me is the Association of Water Technologies. And at last year's conference in Vancouver, Canada, I saw a paper delivered that I thought was so well thought out and had some of the best demonstrations that I remember seeing in a very long time. I wanted to bring that to you. So, Nation, here is that interview. I have not one but two lab partners today, so let me please introduce Louis Godbout and Simina Alungulesa of TGWT. Welcome both to the Scaling Up podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Well, I was lucky to be at Vancouver last year, and the presentation that you both gave, I thought was one of the best demonstrated presentations of user participation or audience participation. You guys had visual aids. It was so well done, and I'm really excited to share with the Scaling Up Nation what you all found during your research of that paper.
Well, we're glad to share. We were very excited to be there too, although we got wet. Well, I got Simina wet in doing those demonstrations.
I will say that is the first presentation that I've ever been to at AWT where there was a designated splash zone in the front row.
Yes.
Well, before we get started talking about that, how about we introduce you both to the Scaling Up Nation? So, Simina, why don't we start with you? Do you mind telling the Scaling Up Nation a bit about yourself?
Yes, of course. So I basically joined TGWT 2 years ago. And the first thing I did when I joined was to actually work on this project that we've held in for 2 years before sharing with everyone. A little bit about my background. So I'm trained as a chemical engineer. And I also did my master's also in chemical engineering, but a bit more on the wastewater treatment side. So I'm technically a bit of a newbie when it comes to the industrial water treatment side.
Excellent. Well, you could not tell any of that newbiness at all from your presentation. So you are no longer a newbie. You are a seasoned veteran.
Yes, she's a quick learner, and it was the most wonderful addition to our team. Everybody in TGWT want to steal her away from the lab. And that's good in a way because she gets some field experience. But so I'm Louis Godbout. I've been with TGWT for over 6 years now. But I hail from the pulp and paper industry. I worked as an academic associate at McGill University's Pulp and Paper Research Center. It's a center that's existed since 1927. And the gist of my research initially was on cellulose and cellulose liquid crystals. I have many patents on these wonderful, colorful materials. And then I moved on more to colloidal science. And because it's important in the pulp and paper industry, as well as in wastewater treatment, getting things to flocculate together. So joining TGWT for me was a really big change in my career, going from an institution to a small business. That's really something. You look at the numbers, and eventually I became a small shareholder. And so I believe in what we do, and I enjoy myself as never before. I'm the boss, you see, in my little section, for the two of us. But we're really colleagues, Simina and I. It's very enjoyable working with her.
If somebody listening hasn't heard of TGWT, how would you describe what you all do?
Oh, shall I have a go, Simina? Okay.
Yeah, you go for it.
The main goal of TGWT is, our slogan is to make water treatment simple, durable, and affordable or profitable. So the more general goal is to offer vegetal extracts for water treatment. And that's nothing new because the very first treatment that worked in a boiler was tannin-based. But things have been refined and, the chemistry is complicated, as you'll see, but we're really proud of our accomplishments.
So I've been told that TGWT stands for the guys with tannin. Is that right?
The tannin guys and girls.
Yes.
I just think that's so cool. That's the real name.
This was because we had another name, and every time we came across people at the AWT, especially, they would say, "Oh, you're the tannin guys," and so eventually we changed that. But the TGWT could also stand for the green water treatment.
Okay.
Various interpretations.
Well, I'm curious. You all have so much to do, and then out of the blue, you decided we're going to study carryover. Tell us about that.
Okay, well, why carryover? That was one of the first questions that was asked of me. As I said, I've done fundamental research on biopolymers, especially cellulose, but lignin as well, and hemicelluloses. Tannins were new to me as an area of study, but the first thing that I was asked here was why, in most of our insulations, can we go beyond the ASME limits? And that seemed like a question I could answer easily, but I was misled by the information that you find in any, boiler manual or handbook, because the explanations that are given for high TDS carryover are just wrong. And initially, I wanted to build or construct or have access to a surface tension measurement apparatus that would work at high pressures and temperatures. But the only one I found was at the Soviet Aeronautical Institute, and it probably didn't exist anymore. But because TGWT offers a treatment that is affordable and that saves gas and water by cycling up, we wanted to understand why. There were many mysteries about tannins, and because the chemistry is complicated, it's not obvious. I don't know if you recall, but a few years back, I did a presentation on the passivation layer, comparing the passivation layer that develops with tannins versus other chemistries. And that was a first step. But the carryover issue was really fundamental. We've had some of our customers who had problems that they could not solve immediately, a blocked blowdown valve. And we have documented evidence of boilers operating at 77,000 conductivity with the condensate conductivity at 15 or thereabouts microsiemens. So that's just incredible. And but what we found more fundamentally is that this type of carryover is intimately linked with the other types of carryover that Simina will go over. The reason we started this was really why does it work? Why has it been working? And if you look in the history of tannin treatment, you see mentions of that it prevents carryover. There's less foaming. And these documents date back centuries, really.
Let's define a couple of terms. So we've talked about tannin a couple times. If you were to introduce to the audience and somebody out there listening has never heard of that technology, how would you define that?
Well, I would say it's one molecule does all, because tannins, they have been of great industrial significance throughout history. And actually, the first chemical test that was ever described, and I'm talking around 70 AD, Pliny the Elder describes how tannins will form a complex, a dark precipitate with iron salts. And so there's a love story between iron and tannins, but also with hardness, with other metals. They form complexes. And the very funny thing about it all is when you find all that information in an old book, a rare book, and I'm a book collector, so I know about that, the ink that is used is actually iron tannate. It's that bluish black precipitate. And that was defined as permanent ink. If you look at legal definitions of permanent ink and recipes for permanent ink, it's always or was for a very, very long time iron tannate. And so tannins were the discovery that tannins could prevent scaling. That was very early in the 19th century. And because tannins were ubiquitous because they were used to make leather. And before plastic, everything was made of leather, the saddles, horses, shoes, shoe soles. You have to imagine this world of the 19th and early 20th century where leather, and it's still present with us. And the industry is a very well-established industry, the tannin extract industry. It's made millions over the years. It's now mostly based in South America, a bit in South Africa as well. But in the United States, entire forests where the trees had good bark with full of tannins, the forests were stripped of the tannins because it was more precious. The wood, there was wood everywhere that was worthless, but the tannins, the tannin extract companies in the 1880s, they were the Google of the time, in terms of the capitalization. And of course, railroads and transportation took over then, but they remained a valuable product. But the problem with studying tannins is that their chemistry is extremely complex. There are small oligomers, and there are 4 monomers that can be linked in 2 different ways. And different species of trees and plants, they have different forms of tannins. But what we know about tannins, their function in nature is linked to their function as a tanning agent for making leather because they are a protection for the tree. They will attach very tightly to proteins, and so they will deactivate the bacterial or fungi enzymes. And that's why in leather, when you seep a piece of the animal skin in a tannin solution, the tannin will absorb and stabilize the proteins and prevent them from rotting and degrading. And if you take it into your mouth, pure tannin, it's extremely astringent, because it reacts with the proteins in your saliva, the proteins on the linings of your mouth. And, of course, even if people have not heard of tannin in water treatment, they've heard of tannin in wine, if they're wine drinkers. And the same reason that your red wine goes bad is the reason that you can use it in a boiler. It's that tannins react readily with oxygen. And so that's why they're also an oxygen scavenger.
So the next time you have a bad bottle of wine, you just throw it in the boiler and we're good to go.
Well, if it's bad, it's already taken up the oxygen. So, but this is not an easy reaction, Joe. Tannins with oxygen, it's a cascade of reactions. It can go in several ways, depending on pH, temperature. So those are the fundamental things about tannins, is that they scavenge oxygen, they act as crystal modifiers, they act as dispersants, and they also complex metals and form these precipitates. So tannin-treated boilers, they will form, like if there's a lot of hardness entering the boiler, they will form a sludge that will be blown down rather than forming a scale.
So with all of that, let's move to the other term that we're talking about today, and that is carryover. How would you define that?
I'll let Simina have a go at that.
So that's ongoing work of 2 years. So I think Louis was talking earlier about some common misconceptions. And it's funny because when I started directly with this project. And as I was learning the basics of a boiler and a cooling tower, I was also asked to solve this really complex question. So the process of it was really fun to come at it from both sides. But coming back to the carryover, so Louis mentioned there are 2 main misconceptions. So we think that high alkalinity makes the water soapy, and therefore you have more bubbles, decreases the surface tension, which Louis mentioned is not true. And then we also often focused on the foam as being just at the surface. But as we dug into this whole phenomenon, we realized that we can tentatively categorize carryover maybe in 3 different sections. So the first one would be maybe more mechanical, and that's what we call priming. So for instance, when you have a high demand of steam, or when you have new equipment added into your line and you have multiple boilers and they're not well balanced, then you can have what we call priming, where you have a depressurization, and then this causes a surge of boiling. The next one would be more on the chemical side, meaning contamination. So, for instance, if you have animal or vegetal fats and oils at that high pH, they will get saponified, and then you'll have this foam that you'll see at the surface. But the third one, which is what we actually focused on, so the third type of carryover, which is high TDS, high dissolved solids, that was really the beast of the whole project, because what we realized is instead of focusing at the surface, at the foaming on the surface, we actually had to go look at the bulk of the solution and realize that when you have high amounts of dissolved solids, but not any type of salt, which that's a whole other chapter. But we realized that there's this phenomenon that happens, which is a bubble coalescence inhibition. So at the AWT, we did a presentation with a lot of visuals. And the reason why we did that, it's because it's just, you can't really get it unless you see it. And it's very simple. So, next time you boil water to make your pasta and you throw some salt in it, you're actually going to be able to see that you have those small little bubbles forming. So this bubble coalescence inhibition actually has a cascade of factors that will influence how steam is formed and how carryover can happen. And to make matters even more complex, priming and high TDS can sort of combine and create sort of intensify the carryover. So that's, I'm just scratching the surface here, but this is pretty much what we've been studying for the past few years. And what we've realized is that in the beginning, we were very focused on lab experiments and sort of just looking at one thing at a time, which is normal. But as you try to transfer your lab knowledge onto the field, onto a pilot scale, in a big boiler, you realize that it's a lot of little elements sort of combine and collide, and you have to basically make a lot of measurements to really pinpoint where your carryover is coming from.
Just recently, I was at the Association of Water Technology's technical training, and somebody asked me, why is carryover such a big deal? And I always like to explain BTU content. And of course, that's the energy that's doing the work. And steam on its worst day has 1,150 BTUs, where water on its best day has 180. And just by knowing that, you can see that there's just not enough energy to work. So the fact that you all are helping us make sure that our boilers are putting out the right amount of BTUs and studying all of this in the lab are going to make all of us better water treaters so we can understand what's going on. So with that being said, I'm curious. So you decided you're going to discover what is carryover, how do we affect it, and what did you do then? How did you decide how you were going to test it?
Well, I had a eureka moment. And that
were you in a bathtub, actually?
No, but I wasn't in the water, but I was looking at the water, not plunging into it. So the reason that this has escaped, the true reason for carryover, the reason that it's escaped the common knowledge is that there was confusion. We were not the first to try and see, how bubbles work in a boiler. And when we did try to see videos, we went like on the Spyrex Sarco site and other sites where they build the transparent boilers and you can see what is going on. But the problem with some of these boilers is that they build a part at the surface. And so when they see the foaming, they increase the conductivity. And then when they reach that critical point, they say, well, foam accumulates. And then in one of these videos, they even simulate an image below where you see like big bubbles and then foam at the surface. And that would be the case if the carryover were caused by contamination, oily contamination. And that is really the classical case of, making bubbles with soap and reducing the surface tension. But, it's the reverse that happens in a boiler. The salts that accumulate typically in a boiler, they will increase the surface tension. So what is going on? Well, it turns out that in the 1920s, there was this professor at Ohio University. His name was Fulk, and he built an appropriate boiler to study from the bottom to the top the flow of these bubbles. But he confused two things. When you increase the TDS or conductivity, are there more small bubbles generated? Or is it that the bubbles do not coalesce? And he wavered between the two. Eventually, he did find the solution, and that led to a lot of industrial efforts by the Dearborn Company to try and find defoamers. Because, this problem of foaming, it dates back to the beginning of boilers. And, people have thought of throwing in just anything. The old solution was castor oil. But often in throwing in these products or trying to develop the products, they were confronted with the fact that in a boiler, the chemical conditions, high pH, high temperature, is bad for it makes almost everything degrade. And if you want to cycle up, you're keeping these molecules in the boiler for a longer time. So it gives them time to degrade even more. But we'll get back to that, the degradation of antifoams. But the main thing that was discovered and that was in the 1990s, 1993, this scientist, Craig, he discovered that if you increase the concentration of ions, you would sometimes get inhibition of bubble coalescence, but sometimes not. It depended which pairs of ions. You have an anion, a cation, and he just decided to lump them, in two categories. He called them alphas or betas. And if you have two alphas or two betas, you concentrate them, you get inhibition of bubble coalescence. But if you have an alpha and a beta, then you can concentrate them, as high as the solution will hold them, and you will never get that. And that was the start of a really serious effort to understand, physically and chemically what is going on with this bubble coalescence. And so they went into a lot of measurements. And, there are 1,000 ways of measuring bubble size, going from, turbidity to image analysis. And I'm skipping quite a few more sophisticated ones. But the consequences of having small bubbles, as Simina said, this is something you can observe. For boaters who bring their boats on freshwater lakes and in seawater, if they look back at the wake, they will see that there's a lot more persistent foaming behind their boat when they're in seawater. And in seawater, also, you get a lot more of foamy waves. And that is because when the wave captures and brings down into the water some of the air, it creates small bubbles that will not coalesce. It's just above the critical point, seawater. And that has an environmental aspect to it, too, because these small bubbles, one of the consequences of having small bubbles is that the pressure inside a small bubble. This is an experiment that people will, a demonstration that is typical if you've taken classes in surface chemistry. You take a big bubble, you take a small bubble, and they're connected by a tube. And you have your students guess, when I open the valve, what will happen? And people think they will equilibrate. You'll get two bubbles of the same size, but that's not true at all. What happens is that the small bubble collapses and all the air goes into the bigger bubble because the pressure inside a big bubble is much less than in a small bubble. It varies with the inverse of the radius. This is very, very well known. And the consequence of this in a boiler, if you have small bubbles that are created at the hot surface, which is what you want, they will detach from that surface and start, by their buoyancy, they will start floating up, but they will reach a terminal speed. And that terminal speed is proportional to the square of the radius. So if you just have in your hand, take a fizzy drink and look at bubbles moving up, you will see that big bubbles move up very much faster. As I said, the square of the radius is the terminal speed. That's for a sphere. Of course, bubbles are not perfect spheres, but, it's a gross approximation. And so what that means in the boiler, having small bubbles, is that they are moving slowly. And therefore, for a given amount of steam that you want to produce, there's more of these small bubbles that are slowly getting to the surface. And so instead of having 10 or 15% of steam in your water mass, you have 20 or 30 once you reach a critical point where the bubbles are small. And that makes that big water mass extremely sensitive. Small variations in pressure, it will just expand very quickly. There's no need of a phase transition. So that's one reason that small bubbles are bad. The other reason is that if the bubbles are really, really small, then because the pressure inside them is so high, that means that once they reach the surface and break open, their pressure is so high that they eject material. And once again, if you have a soft drink in which the bubbles are very fine and you get your nose close to it, you'll feel, or even if you put a small piece of paper above it, you will see the paper will get imbibed. And so these tiny droplets, they are part of the carryover because they're salty water from the boiler. And they are easily, because, just as a small bubble rises slowly, a small droplet falls slowly. And so it takes only a very small amount of steam flow to carry these small droplets, and you will have wet steam. And the final reason why small bubbles are bad is that they act as nucleation sites. The people, if you think about it, everybody's done this in their life, for fun or whatever. Or if you win a car race, you shake that champagne bottle and then you open it. If you don't shake it, why doesn't it spurt? Well, it doesn't spurt because it takes a nucleation site for a bubble to form, for that gas in solution to go out of solution, or in the case of steam, for the phase transition to occur, it needs to form an interface. And because, in theory, you would need infinite pressure in the bubble, but, because, it's not a smooth system, bubbles will spontaneously form. But, this is what we showed at the AWT. We had two bottles that we had gasified, so we dissolved CO2 in it. We couldn't use steam, the boiling water, because that would have been dangerous. But if you shake one, you see immediately that the turbidity is higher in the one because the small bubbles are not coalescing. And then when you open, they're at the same pressure, there's the same amount of gas dissolved, but because there are many more small bubbles, when you open the one that is above that critical concentration, it will really spurt like crazy. And the other one will sort of, do a fine spurt. So that's what we discovered, that everything was linked.
It was a great demonstration, and you all definitely prove when it comes to bubbles, size matters. How did you measure that in your experiments?
So I have countless hours of videos on bubbles. That's all I can say. So, as Louis mentioned, there are many ways to sort of quantify it, let's say. I know, Louis, before I arrived at TGWT, you had done some maybe image analysis and turbidity measurements. When I arrived, we went on more visual at first because you can really, really see it. So at first, we went visual about it. We used simply just an air diffuser, tried different salt concentrations, tried different antifoams. I tried water before and after boiler conditions, and just to get a visual feel of it, let's say. Then after we moved, tried to make it a bit more technical, let's say. So as Louis mentioned, when you have those small bubbles that burst at the surface because of that big pressure, you get an ejection. So then we thought, okay, that's another indirect way of measuring it. So we came up sort of with our little device, which is patent pending, that would allow us to measure that, let's say, carryover potential indirectly.
Yes, that was Simina's invention. Just having a conductivity probe essentially with a voltage bias to bring those droplets that are ejected, if they are. But, the transition between coalescence and inhibition of coalescence is not a very precise concentration. It occurs over a small range of concentration. And what is really interesting, and this was not our work, but the work, strangely, I worked at McGill for 20 years, and Simina studied at McGill and did her master's there as well. And it turned out that people were studying bubbles at McGill, but contrary to us, we want to keep bubbles big so that they rise to the surface rapidly. They don't create all these problems that I described. It turned out that in the mining and metallurgy department, where there's a lot of flotation, well, they want small bubbles because there's more surface area and, to attach whatever they're trying to float to the surface. And so they had done a lot of fundamental work, and they had built a machine that there's a picture of it in our publication. But unfortunately, it could not work at high temperatures, the materials and all that. So we didn't use it. But they discovered that it's not really the concentration of the salt. If you have an appropriate salt, so an alpha cation, an alpha anion, most salts that accumulate in boilers are alpha salts. And so they will lead to carryover. But what they discovered is that there was a very big difference in concentration between monovalent salts and bivalent salts. And it turns out, for instance, you need 3 times more NaCl than sodium sulfate. Sodium sulfate, you need maybe 0.1 molar. And sodium chloride, you need 0.3 molar for the phenomenon to happen. And this was talking to us as well, because the most common oxygen scavenger is sodium sulfite, of course. Everybody knows, it's chemistry. But the reaction product of sodium sulfite is sodium sulfate. And when that accumulates in the boiler, it will lead to an earlier onset, if you're just measuring the concentration of that particular salt, and any bivalent salt. And so if you plot all the different salts and see what their inhibition, the critical inhibition concentration is, you will get different values. But if you plot the ionic strength, and I don't know if it's a concept that people are familiar with, but it's essentially a measure of how well charges will mask other charges. And it's related to the valence or to the charge of the ion. And so ionic strength varies from material to material. But if you plot that, you get a linear equation. All the salts fall on the same line. And so it's really a question of ionic strength. And so people, of course, if you want a strategy, a simple strategy for controlling carryover, of course, you can use materials that do not contribute to adding conductivity. But that's like an obvious one.
So during your experimentations, you worked with defoamer. What did you find on that?
We started with the basics, and we started with what is typically used in the industry. And of course, antifoams were just the obvious thing to start with. And when we started doing the experiments, obviously with the antifoams, you're expecting the foam at the surface to disappear. But we were like, okay, let's see if antifoams actually have an effect on the bubble coalescence, which is what we're interested in. So once again, took out my camera, started filming. And we realized that, yes, indeed, a lot of the antifoams that are presently used in the industry, they do have a positive effect on bubble coalescence, which means even at very, very high conductivities, that bubble coalescence inhibition with an antifoam present is not going to happen. And then we took it one step further, and we took our little, pressure reactors, and we're like, okay, let's see how this acts in the actual conditions of a boiler, because that's what we're interested in. And funny thing Louis talked about it earlier, if you look at typical antifoams based on polyglycols, if you put them in boiler conditions, what actually happens is that they degrade into surface active substances, which means they actually create even more foam. And the higher the cycles, the higher the residence time, and the more foam you're actually going to create. So you're going to keep adding more antifoam because you're getting foam, and it's just, a vicious cycle. So that was bad news, unfortunately. So we're like, okay, just forget about the polyglycols and let's look at some other antifoams. So let's say silica-based antifoams, silicon. So again, we did the same test. They work perfectly in ambient conditions. Bubble coalescence is restored. Everyone's happy. We put them in boiler conditions, and the same thing again. They started degrading. This was a bit problematic because we're like, okay, the one solution that we thought we had under control for carryover, suddenly it's not working how we thought it was going to work. And I'll give this one to Louis, but then obviously we're like, okay, how come with tannins we seem to be able to increase that conductivity and we're not getting that same phenomenon? There's must be something else happening.
Yeah. So in my presentation, I actually used the very first experiment that I did. When I had my eureka moment, I immediately did, it was a simple setup. I took a fritted glass filter as a diffuser. I put it on top of an Erlenmeyer and started producing steam. And then I just poured some water into that funnel and watched the bubbles. And actually, this bubble coalescence, if you have a diffuser, it occurs at the very surface. You have the impression that the bubbles generated at the surface are big to start with, but that's because they start coalescing. They're very close together in a typical fritted glass filter. As soon as they touch, they become big. But as soon as you add salt beyond that critical concentration, that corresponds to the ASME guidelines, roughly, and the conductivity guidelines as well. So as soon as I did that, I saw it became milky, lots of small bubbles. And then I added the tannins and it reverted to big bubbles. And so my first idea was that having digested the fact that alpha cations, alpha anions, beta anions, beta cations, and you needed to have the same, I thought, well, tannins in solution at high pH, they are anions. And many of the beta anions are organic ions, like acetate. Like if you have sodium acetate, you have an alpha cation, a beta anion. You can concentrate that as much as you want. The bubbles will stay big. And so I thought, well, adding tannins, it's sort of whatever is happening physically, and that I won't go into because it's too complex. Whatever partition of ions between the vapor and the bulk of the water is driving this mechanism, preventing bubbles, even if they collide together. And people have done that, having bubbles collide at different speeds and see, how they resist coalescing and how they must be kept together more depending on the ionic conditions. So anyways, I thought that it was the presence of these beta anions, the tannin anions, that was the effective mechanism. But it turned out to be wrong, because when we redid experiments in very pure water, we couldn't see the phenomenon. Tannins didn't work. They needed an extra little thing. And that extra little thing is actually the presence of a little bit of hardness. And we haven't proven that beyond a doubt, but what we think we measured particle size using very well-known light scattering experiments. People have that in their lab, dynamic light scattering. You can measure the size of a particle, and it turns out that these precipitates of calcium or magnesium tannate, they have the right size to act as antifoams. And so we believe that that is the mechanism. And we didn't show that in a totally perfect manner, but we showed it empirically. When we have a boiler, we add a certain amount of tannins in pure water because we work with an experimental boiler. We went from the lab to real boilers, and then we went to bigger boilers as well. But in our experimental boiler using reverse osmosis water, adding tannins and then bringing up the salt concentration, it didn't prevent carryover. But we needed to add a little bit of hardness. And people in the field, they have the misconception that if their test shows that there's no calcium, no hardness in the softening water, well, it means there is zero. There is not zero. You can use finer analytical techniques that will, the limit that people have to keep in mind if they want to go beyond the ASME limits, if they want to cycle up, the limit that you can see with the typical areochrome black test, the pink and blue transition that everybody uses, well, the limit there is 0.5. But if there's 0.4 present, you won't know. And if you concentrate 0.4 100 times because you want to cycle up, and we do that, and we've done that since the first day one of our company. Our sales are based on energy savings. So we sell this product as a product that will allow for high cycles. And if you have 0.4, you don't see it. You think you have zero. You concentrate 100 times, you actually have 40. So, ppm of calcium. And that, we can handle. But even in normal cycles, there's enough calcium and magnesium present to transform the tannin into an antifoam particle that is thermally stable. That's the key thing, as Simina was saying.
Is there any liability that the water treater accepts if they exceed the ASME limits?
Well, I know that in the United States, it's one of your national sports, suing each other.
This is not inaccurate.
Yeah. Here too, there are a lot of lawsuits, but these are guidelines, and we quote this in our paper because we found it interesting. Even on the ABMA, so the Boiler Manufacturers Association of America, even on their website, when they explain what carryover is, they say this is not, sometimes, this limit must be respected, otherwise you'll get carryover, but in other times not. And, there's no explanation to it. I don't know if you have the exact quote on hand, Simina.
I do actually. So it says these guidelines should not be considered absolute. Some systems cannot tolerate operations at this concentrations. Others operate continuously at significantly higher concentrations.
So it gives us a leeway because it's a guideline. Unfortunately, in some countries, for instance, Germany, where we have our partners, Korn, with which we share our knowledge and know-how and industrial secrets, they have a legally mandated conductivity limit. And so they are bound by that. And so they're bound not to go to higher energy and water savings. And to remind people, the reason you're saving in energy and in water, and if you have to pay also for treating the effluent, you're saving on all that because, if you're at 20 cycles, you're throwing away 5% of the water that you've treated, that you've purchased, that you've heated. And, you can try and recover the heat. Most big boilers will, recover this heat, but you're still wasting a lot. You know this very well because you teach it, cycling up, your savings go down as the cycles go up. So If you go from 10 to 20, that's a big gain. From 20 to 40, it's a diminishing return. But at the end of the year, whether you save 1% or 2% or even 0.5%, it is big usually. And our biggest customer is a pulp and paper mill that produces billions of pounds of steam. And we've had them for, decades, or close to 2 decades. And we keep track of the savings and remind people, without us, you were not operating at these cycles.
You got to let them remember why you're there.
Yes.
I'm curious. This really was a fascinating study, and I appreciate you sharing it with the AWT audience and now the Scaling Up Nation. What's next for this study?
Well, as we are a research duo, let's put it that way, we're often, at the end of a project, we are always trying to think ahead and see what direction to take, and also the direction has to align with the mission, right? So the green water treatment, we're trying to go into a greener direction. So recently, we've started a new project that is more directed, let's say, towards the cooling tower side. So we're trying to diversify. I think we've had our fair share of of troubles with the carryover and boilers. So trying to look at different problems. But it's always an ongoing continuation of researching, and it's new things always come up.
Yeah, we have what we develop principally in terms of, Simina mentioned, we have this device patent pending. Okay, so this device, what it allows us to do, and the advantage it gives us is because there are so many variations in the source of water, the composition of water. This device, it allows us to quickly evaluate the potential for cycling up. So we can simulate in the lab with a water sample how far people can go. I mean, as most of your audience knows, diagnosing why you have carryover, you have to delve in this, you have to see the system, see the operation, see what goes on. If everybody at 10 o'clock opens up the valves at the same time, this is a mechanical issue. And what we find is that, most of the time, carryover is due to mechanical issues. But if it's combined with high TDS, the problem is really worse. It worsens everything. And it makes the boiler more sensitive to any variation in pressure. But this little tool is essentially, people can send us a water sample, or they can even send us an analysis, and we can reconstitute in the lab their water sample that matches the boiler water. And then we can see how far can we go? How far can we go with this treatment? How far can we go with that treatment? And many, many people, the mistake that they make with the anti-foams is that they overuse them. And when you start cycling up, of course, if your dosage is 1,000 ppm in the boiler of your product, whatever you're using, but you're at 100 cycles, you're actually feeding 10 ppm because it will get concentrated to 1,000 in the boiler. And so as you increase the cycles, you're reducing the amount of the anti-foam that you're putting in and allowing what has already been injected in to degrade. And so you reach a tipping point where, even if you add more anti-foam, there's already enough of these degradation products that are actual surfactants that will create a problem. And so it's not the solution. If you look at the history of all this, the history of the development of heat-stable anti-foams, as I said, the Dearborn Company had 2 or 3 scientists full-time for a couple of decades. And the best that they came up with, you needed to refeed. It worked at extremely, as all anti-foams do, it worked at really low dosages, less than 1 ppm, but it lasted an hour and then it was gone. The effect was gone. It degraded. And so that's why you can't use conventional antifoams to cycle up. I don't like people who are not skeptical. When we bring our product to people, if they say, oh, let's go, we want this, blah, 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 I don't like it. Because to really run a program, a high cycle program appropriately, you need to be driving carefully. You're concentrating everything 100 times. And so the least little bit of failure in your softeners, you'll be bringing loads of it and loads of hardness. So that, this is one consideration, but the carryover consideration is also quite critical. And with tannins, something that people should know is that, those who are totally unfamiliar, tannins are colored. Like a boiler treated with tannins, the water is whiskey colored or bourbon or whatever your favorite.
You all used to say sweet tea colored. I see
yes.
It changed to whiskey.
Yeah,
That's great. Simina, I am curious. You did such a great job presenting. What was your methodology? How did you prepare to publicly speak in front of that audience?
Thank you. That's a good question. So I prepared the hell out of it so much
There it is.
until it seemed natural. So that's the tipping point. You prepare a little bit, you sound too prepared. You prepare a lot, you sound more natural, at least in my experience.
Well, Louis, Simina, thank you so much for sharing what you found during this experiment and continuing to experiment so we can all be better water treaters.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for having us. It's really great.
Well, once again, thanks to Louis and Simina. I really enjoyed your paper at the Association of Water Technologies conference, and I immensely enjoyed being able to bring that to life here through the Scaling Up H2O podcast and bring that information and making it available to tens of thousands of listeners. Now, if you are one of those listeners, and of course you are because you're listening to this, their paper is going to be on our show notes page. So make sure you navigate to scalinguph2o.com and we will have everything that they referenced there for your viewing pleasure. Nation, do you have a guest that you want me to interview? Maybe you went to one of the conferences that we mentioned earlier in a show, and you just found the most amazing presentation that needs to be shared with the Scaling Up Nation. If you have that information, please go to scalinguph2o.com, go over to our show ideas page, and let us know what that is. We are always looking for the best guests to have on the Scaling Up H2O podcast, so you can, of course, become better each podcast you listen to. And, of course, somebody that helps us each and every week with making ourselves better, here is James McDonald.
Hello and welcome to the Periodic Water Table with James, where we think and learn about water chemistry drop by drop. Please use your week to search online, ask your colleagues, or even pick up a book to learn more about each week's periodic water table topic. If you do, at the end of the year, you'll be 52 water chemistry smarter. So let's raise the water table of knowledge together and get started. Today's topic is hydrogen peroxide, or H2O2. While we may find it in our medicine cabinets, it has uses in industrial water treatment too. First, what are these uses? How is hydrogen peroxide introduced into a system? Do you purchase pure hydrogen peroxide, or is it generated in situ? If in situ, what other chemicals are involved? Is hydrogen peroxide fast or slow acting? What can cause a hydrogen peroxide solution to decompose? Is this decomposition reaction exothermic or endothermic? What are the reaction byproducts of decomposed hydrogen peroxide? Can decomposition cause a dangerous situation? How do you test for hydrogen peroxide? Remember, knowledge is power, and taking the time to learn more about water chemistry each week will help make you a force to be reckoned with. Be sure to post what you learned to social media and tag it with hashtag WaterTable23 and hashtag ScalingUpH2O. I look forward to learning more from you.
Thank you, James. Nation, I hope you have so many things to celebrate this June. And I hope one of the things that you celebrate is scheduling to take your certified water technologist examination. I talk a lot about the CWT examination if you are in the same type of water treatment that I am, because that defines to the world that you are among the people that are making this industry better. You are committed to it, and those 3 letters beyond your name let everybody know that. But here's what it also does. Nation, when you get your CWT, I promise it will unlock this unfound confidence within you, and it will drive you to become better because you achieve something that is just amazing, and you will not want to stop there. It is the key to unlocking your desire to become such an amazing force through understanding in our industry. So I urge you to schedule to take your CWT today. And to bring you a little bit of help, I have a free course explaining exactly what you need to do in order to obtain your certified water technologist designation. And you can get that free gift by going to scalinguph2o.com/CWT prep. Once again, that's scalinguph2o.com/CWT prep. Nation, I sure enjoy bringing you this podcast, and I hope that you make today the best day this year. We'll have a brand new episode for you next Friday.